This essay is a collaboration with Mr.Z. Check out his channel below. So yeah, let's get into it. What is political power? All political movements want power, but there are many different ideas of what power even means. In this video essay, we will look at the ways that the different ideologies think about power, and specifically, where they think that political power comes from. Political power can be best defined as the capability to make people do things that you want them to do. If you have no political power, you cannot influence the actions of those around you. In a state of total anarchy, where no one has any political power, everybody is free to do whatever they want.
Naturally, however, anarchy in this sense is never a permanent state. For so long as there is want and need, humanity will default to power structures of some form. That is, everyone can do whatever they want until they can't. Until someone or a group of someones finds a way to get an edge over everyone else, and impose their will, their political power on everyone else. So the question of where political power comes from could be reframed as the question of how many ways are there to force someone to do something? Number 1. Capital. In contemporary times, money is a powerful motivator. Some might even call it a civilized form of coercion. Money can buy allegiance, even if only temporary. It can motivate individuals to do what they otherwise wouldn't. It can be used to provide or to deprive others of resources they need to succeed, fight, and survive. It can make life more comfortable, or make survival very difficult. It is, or rather is intended to be a physical representation of value produced, or one's worth in and contribution to the community. Though of course wealth can also be acquired through more underhanded means by exploiting the wealth system and its people. But for all the power money offers, it almost always is subject to control and influence from outside forces. Its power can wax and wane beyond the wielder's control, and over time it can be consolidated or lost. In free market societies especially, capital holds disproportionate power, free from hefty regulation and restriction and often absent a powerful government force capable of keeping it in check. Those with the means to do so can use their wealth to shape policy and society. They buy ad space for their agendas and politicians, they fund the institutions they want to prosper. They employ those they deem worthy of employment and sideline those they don't. In a more soft-handed and civilized way, those who use money power allow for a guise of free competition while providing financial advantages to their preferred groups to help them succeed. In this sense, money power often leads to rivalries, as wealth rivals will use the people and institutions of their communities as pawns in a game to bring society closer to their ideals. Number 2. Violence. Violence or might is quite possibly the oldest source of power in our history as a species, and even amongst animals, strength and the capacity to inflict harm is most often the means through which status and authority are established in a group. This is wired into our biology. We have adapted to not only survive in our world, but to physically compete within our groups for a place in the hierarchy. While this is still visible today on the individual level, it has largely been sidelined and intentionally obfuscated by higher authorities. Violence, we're told, is wrong and we should never resort to it, and even in instances of self-defense, we find individuals utilizing violence penalized by the state maintaining an essential monopoly over legal violence. On the larger scale, the scale of nations, violence is still in common use, though for the past several decades there has been an attempt to downplay it in favor of diplomacy, in large part because our state-level capacity for violence, or rather the potential for destruction we are capable of inflicting, has grown so out of control that mutually assured destruction has been and generally remains a realistic concern. The reality is that for as civilized as we'd like to consider ourselves, when matters come down to do or die, when a person or country faces the prospect of death, it becomes insufficient to simply continue playing the political, diplomatic, and economic game. A country facing unwarranted invasion or encroachment cannot stop the invasion with economic sanctions or strong words. One might see such an example in the case of Ukraine and Russia, both of whom felt encroached upon, Ukraine by Russia's annexation of Crimea and support for the Donbass, and Russia by rising Western influence within Ukraine and the prospective expansion of NATO to their border. The natural result of this, with all other avenues exhausted, is organized violence, also known as war.
3. Information. Another way to force someone to do what you want is to mislead them. Whoever has the power to control the information that you trust has undeniable power over you. This can be used to hide inconvenient truths or to directly deceive. Whatever the case, information control is a source of political power because it is the ability to shape the collective perception of reality. If we even want to be more dramatic, we could say that it is the power to create collective hallucinations. The important thing to mention is that this source of political power exists beyond North Korea, and indeed is also present in the countries with freedom of the press. This is because there are only a handful of institutions that are seen as credible, and therefore these institutions have a de facto monopoly on information. Technically, both InfoWars and the BBC both have the power to publish whatever they want. But in reality, there is a huge power imbalance. I already made an essay on this here, so I will not go really deep into it. But one example of the power of information was the justification of the Iraq War. Most of the American population, and indeed most of the world, was induced into invading Iraq because the most credible institutions at the time asserted that Saddam and his hypothetical weapons of mass destruction were an imminent threat. 4. Ideology. Perhaps the most powerful source of political power is ideology. Money can run out, information can be distrusted, and violence can be countered. But if you have the power to control the ideas that a person comes to believe, you will always have power over them. The power of ideology comes primarily from education and media, or indoctrination and propaganda if we want to be less generous. These are the sources where most of the population get their values and ideas, and therefore whoever controls them will also have a great amount of political power based around making people do what you want them to do by convincing them that it is the right thing to do. Perhaps one of the most dramatic examples of the power of ideology is the mass suicide of Jonestown. Out of pure conviction, 918 people poisoned themselves in an act of revolutionary suicide. Of course, there is only one small step between this and using such fanatism to ram oneself into the side of an aircraft carrier. The strongest characteristic of ideology is that it can easily tap into the other sources of political power. People who follow an ideology can give large amounts of money, can spread propaganda, and of course can commit quite a lot of violence. All of these sources of political power are without a doubt real, but there is much disagreement between the different ideological camps in the matter of which of these sources of power is the most important one. This depends both on the worldview of each ideology and most importantly on who their followers are. There are more than a few ideologies that believe that money is the most important source of political power. The first one is what we could call modern liberalism, or neoliberalism if you prefer, who of course believe that people are primarily motivated by material concerns. This is evidenced, according to them, by the victory of the capitalist West over the totalitarian ideologies of both fascism and communism, who lost because their sources of political power were less powerful than the pure material prosperity of the West. The other main ideology that generally states that money, although they prefer the term capital, controls the world, are the socialists and communists. They believe that material conditions are the driver of history, and in this sense they place great importance in the matter of who controls the wealth of the society. They believe that this movement of history will inevitably lead to socialism. However, they mostly believe that this movement is not something that's just going to happen by itself. They believe that this can only be achieved by way of a violent revolution where the proletariat will remove the bourgeoisie from power. This idea of revolution reveals that, although leftists say that they believe that our society is driven by capital and that capital has all the power, that they ultimately believe that violence and ideology can triumph against capitalism and its mountains of money, since this has been the case in many successful revolutions throughout the 20th century. So I would say that socialists and communists ultimately believe that power comes from ideology and specifically from ideological violence. The idea that the supreme source of political power is violence is also quite popular in the right wing, with some of the more political realist sections that will likely quote Machiavelli to you. Under this way of thinking, political power directly comes from the use of strategic violence in a military sense, and interestingly, the more libertarian side of the spectrum also fundamentally agrees with this conclusion, and this is the source of their great love for privately owned weaponry. Libertarians, by definition, are in an existential struggle against the idea of political power itself, because they are not big fans of other people forcing them to do things that they do not want to do. In this struggle, they see the world through the lens that political power comes from violence, especially state violence, that they must be able to respond to with violence of their own. The nationalist side of the right wing are also big fans of the idea that power comes from violence, but in a strange turn of events, they agree with the communists that violence comes from ideology, and therefore ideology is supreme. This is the reason that you will find many reactionaries quoting Lenin and even Mao on matters of political strategy. This conclusion is buttressed by the fact that an army made up of ideological fanatics is a superior fighting force to one made up of cynical mercenaries, and the state that runs on ideology is superior to one that runs on political favors. However, I already made an essay on that topic. Finally, there are the centrists that mostly believe that political power comes from popular consent and due process. However, I believe that this is nothing more than to say that they believe that the sources of political power are the current ideology and the sources of information that are widely accepted by society, with some occasional violence from the police sprinkled in. Each one of these sources of power works best under different conditions. Under conditions of anarchy, all the money in the world will not help you. For example, if you're in a room with $1 million and there is another person in this room who has a gun, all of this money will not give you an ounce of power, and in all likelihood, this person will take all your money and you will be powerless to stop him. Information, ideology, and money are sources of political power that are dependent on there being some level of civilization, because in a state of pure anarchy, the only one inexhaustible source of political power is, of course, violence. In contrast, in our civil societies, violence is used reluctantly and as a last resource in the form of the police and the army. But in 99% of cases where political power is exercised, such as collecting taxes or granting permits, it is done without the need of direct violence. So we can say that the more orderly and, for a lack of better word, civilized a society is, the less that direct violence matters and the more information, ideology, and money matter. So, if we want to know where political power comes from in a society, we must first know what type of society we are looking at. If we are looking at Sudan, a country that is in the middle of a civil war between two warlords, we can say that power grows out of the barrel of a gun, in Mao's famous quote. While in our calmer societies, forming an armed militia will not get you political power, but instead will alienate you and lead to an eventual standoff with the police. And, well, we've seen how that ends, no? This correlates quite closely with one of the main ideas of the father of political science himself, Machiavelli. Niccolo Machiavelli stated that there were two types of rulers, the lions and the foxes. The lions got their power from violence alone, while the foxes got their power from intrigue and politics. In war-torn Sudan, the foxes are pretty much useless. This is the land of lions. While in our calmer societies, the opposite is the case. A lion is hopelessly outmatched in the bureaucratic structures where foxes rule. We could even say that all civilizations experience a change from a ruling class made out of lions that forged the nation in some war of independence or conquest, to one made out of foxes that takes over once this society grows and establishes itself. But that leads to a further question. What is the source of political power in our societies as they stand? Without a doubt, in our societies, the dominant sources of political power are institutions. Financial institutions, money, newspapers, information, and universities, ideology. Of course, these all are dominated by foxes. However, we must also keep in mind that these institutions require controlled violence to exist. A pencil pusher at the IRS can order you to pay a set amount of taxes, but this is a piece of paper unless it is backed up by an armed police officer, in the same way that the newspapers and universities can only wield power if they are protected from hostile groups. For example, in the late Weimar Republic, many newspapers were open to intimidation and attack by the brown shirts if they published something critical of the government. As a result, they were powerless. So it is a mistake to think that violence is not still an important source of power inside a Fox-dominated society such as ours. Lions, in this case police officers and soldiers, play an essential role in a Fox-dominated society, but these soldiers and police officers hold practically no political power and are relegated to carrying out the orders of the bureaucratic foxes. Indeed, unlike most other countries in history, generals and soldiers tend not to be elected to higher office very often. But, technically speaking, the police officers, the soldiers, and the generals are fully capable of taking over the government and using it for their benefit. Indeed, army coups and subsequent military dictatorships for the benefit of the army are one of the most common occurrences throughout history. Certainly, the armed forces would be better off if they had complete control of the state. But the question is, why don't they take over the state if it would technically be in their best interest? I think that the answer is pretty simple. There are no rogue army generals because despite their interests, they are ideologically committed to upholding the status quo. So much so that a coup is utterly unthinkable for any Western army officer. Indeed, if an officer did go rogue and attempted to establish a military dictatorship in, let's say, the UK, he would be having a tough time convincing his fellow officers and soldiers to follow him. This would be because you cannot force your fellow soldiers to follow you at gunpoint because they are also armed, and so you can only convince them. In this battle of ideas, our hypothetical rogue officer or general is hopelessly outmatched because he is facing the combined power of the universities, the government institutions, and the press. And even if he managed to give a rousing speech and convince his unit the very same way that Valery Sablin did, he would still have to convince the rest of the army not to shoot at them. In short, there are no rogue army generals, because the generals do not control the minds of their soldiers. This power belongs to whoever educated them, in other words, to the foxes. And here lies the key to the riddle of power in the modern state. For all intents and purposes, power still sort of comes from violence, and this violence is administered by the lions. But although the police officers and the soldiers manage the violence, which is still the primary source of political power, they hold no political power because they do not control their own minds. They hold the sword, but they do not hold the pen. So, at least in my opinion, whoever constructs the ideological narrative that becomes the status quo in a civilized society also holds the actual power within that society. In my opinion, the ultimate source of political power is ideology. 20 years ago, the sources of ideological power would be the universities and the press. But today, this equation has changed slightly, and now the main source of ideological power is tending to be the internet. And this is partly the reason why I am here. In a certain sense, I am a fox, since lions generally do not have Substacks. But for the moment, there is no political use for a lion. But let us also not forget Machiavelli's conclusion that the perfect ruler is both a fox and a lion. Indeed, only such an individual is able to use the four sources of political power. Thank you for listening, and thank you for your time.